It's like a jungle up here. Can you see me? Like peering through the palm leaves? Okay. Jesus' disciples said to him, "Let's go to the Leagues Club for dinner." It's so nice there since they've renovated it. The food is amazing, and the outdoor dining area is adorned with fairy lights. And you know, that club, it gives so much money back to the community. You know, they even donate to school chaplaincy programs. They do so much for kids' sport, and how good is that? Helping kids to be active and healthy and getting out there socially. Jesus looked up and saw a young tradie putting his loaded cart in a pokie machine. "Truly," Jesus said, "I tell you, this young tradie has given more than the club, for they contributed out of their abundance, but he put in all he had to live on." It's a week before Easter, our last week of Lent, and Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem to a crowd of excited people who have hailed him as king. It's the beginning of a week that's going to have many twists and turns, and it will ultimately end in Jesus' death. And at some point in that week, Jesus sees a widow putting in her last 2 coins, everything she owned, into the temple offering. Well, most of us have probably heard this story about the widow's mite before. Maybe you've heard sermons on it. And the message of the sermon was probably something around the value of self-sacrifice, giving your all. Or maybe the value of your financial contribution, no matter how small it is compared with that of others. Or perhaps the widow was held up as a model of someone who trusted in God, someone that we should emulate. She gave her all, knowing that she could trust God to care for her. Well, I have to say, this passage has always bothered me, because I wanted to give my all to God, and so this widow stood as an inspiration to me. She gave her all she had to live on, and so quietly and with such humility that no one but Jesus even noticed. And yet, I couldn't help imagining this woman going home to her one-roomed house where the cupboards were bare, with no money to pay next week's rent. And she lived by the light of a candle, in my imagination, because the electricity had been cut off. I worried about her. Would she be okay? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I'm not sure this was a really good life decision that she's made here. I hoped that God had come through for her. I hoped maybe she won the lottery the next day or something. Maybe God had organised that. Maybe she had a generous neighbour who took care of her. We don't know, do we? Because that narrative camera that I talked about last week, it doesn't sit on the woman's shoulder. We don't go with her after she drops her last pennies in the temple offering. The camera stays with Jesus and his disciples. It moves on. And so readers for the last 2,000 years have just left to wonder what happened to her, because we never meet her again. But she kind of haunts me. Does that happen to anybody else? Or is it just like me? I don't know. Anyway, I was relieved to discover in the last couple of years several gospel scholars in recent times who have challenged what had become the traditional understanding of this story. And their understanding aligns more with that reimagined story that I told you. Jesus looking up and seeing a young tradie putting his loaded cart in a pokie machine. "Truly, I tell you, this young tradie has given more than the club, for they contributed out of their abundance, but he put in all he had to live on. So I, along with a few other gospel scholars, think that this widow is not here in Luke's gospel to be an example to follow. Rather, I think she's a victim. I think that she's a victim of a corrupt religious system. I feel like I've got your attention now. I mean, I could be wrong, and I know that when you have long-held understandings of favourite Bible stories that you've lived by, you might not want somebody coming along and overturning that. I understand that. But if I'm right, and I think I am, I say that very tentatively, then this is really important. And it has real life implications. I think we've misunderstood what Jesus is saying. The generous widow is not an example, she's a victim. Let me try and convince you, okay? Let me, because you're free to disagree. But here's the thing, stories are meant to be read from beginning to end. Perhaps I've said that before. But of course we can't read Luke's 24 chapters in a church service, can we? We'd be here all night. And GYG is waiting. And so what we do is we take bits out of the Gospels, this is what we do, and we look at them in detail, just little snippets. And that's helpful. But the downside is we end up with this whole mishmash of stories in our heads. They're all sort of bumping into one another. They're not really related to each other. But if we read Luke's Gospel from beginning through the end, then there are some things that we start to notice. One of the strong themes in Luke is the use and misuse of wealth. You can trace that theme through the Gospel from beginning to end. I mentioned bits last week. At the very beginning of Luke's story, we read about Mary, Jesus' mother, who, inspired by the Spirit of God, provocatively said that God was going to fill the hungry with good things, but send the rich away empty. A little later, Jesus tells a story about a rich man who foolishly built more and more storage facilities to store his growing pile of wealth instead of using it, which is what you're supposed to do with wealth, using it wisely. Another time, I mentioned this one last week too, Jesus tells a rich ruler that he had become far too attached to his money and he actually should just give it away and things will be better. And then last week, the week before Easter, we met that rich tax collector, remember? Zacchaeus. Jesus didn't ask him to give away anything, but Zacchaeus decided to give half of his money away to the poor anyway. And Jesus commended him for that decision. It's very clear when you read it that Jesus commends Zacchaeus for that decision. And then we get to this last week before Easter, and Jesus arrives at Jerusalem with lots of fanfare and waving of palm branches. And the very first thing he does is he weeps over the city because it strayed so far from what God had intended for it. See, God wanted it to be a place of peace, a little slice of heaven on earth, and instead it's become a place of corruption. The heart of Jerusalem was its temple, the place where God metaphorically lived. And it was supposed to be, the temple was supposed to be a haven for people, a place where people could meet with God, pray to God. But instead, the temple institution had turned into this commercial enterprise that operated at the expense of the average person and especially at the expense of the poor. So the high priests and their cronies in the first century, they were mostly wealthy landowners and they used their position of religious influence for their own gain. They controlled all the wealth in the temple and they set up this economic system for their own benefit. They were behind the retailers who sold animals for the temple sacrificial system, sold at inflated prices. They were behind the currency exchange booths because there's only a certain currency that you can use in the temple. So if you've come in from outside Jerusalem, well, you're going to need to exchange your money. And there was a little bit of a handsome profit skimmed off the top of the currency exchange. So after Jesus finishes weeping over the city, he marches into the temple courts and he starts turning over the currency booth tables and driving out the retailers and the money changers, and he accuses them of corruption and injustice. He said, "You've turned God's house of prayer into a refuge for thieves." Instead of the temple being a safe haven for the people seeking God, it's turned into a safe haven for criminals, ripping people off. And so he comes in, he weeps over Jerusalem, he overturns the tables, and then in the next few days, are you still with me? Yes. Yeah, cool. In the next few days, Jesus spends time in the temple courts. Now I'm up to Luke chapter 20. If you want to go home and check this out for yourself. He spends time in the temple courts teaching his followers. He's reclaiming the space now and doing what it's intended to do. It's a place for people to seek God. Whatever it is that he's teaching, and we're not told, the religious leaders do not like it. All through chapter 20, they make challenges to his authority. There's 5 distinct challenges that they make, and he is highly critical of them. He tells a parable that they know is directed against them. They try to trap him into saying something against Rome's emperor because they know that that'll get him into trouble, but he doesn't fall for it. They quote scripture at him, trying to show him up, but he tells them, "You haven't read your Bibles properly," and explains. And finally, at the very end of chapter 20, Jesus warns his listeners about the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. He says, "Beware of these people," and listen to what he says. They like walking around in clothes that make them look pious, and they love it when people give them elaborate greetings in public. They take the best seats in church and the places of honour at public events. They pray long prayers, but they devour the property of widows. They devour the property of widows. This is the verse before we get into our widow mite story. Nobody's really sure what they were doing that devoured the property of widows. But whatever it was impacting vulnerable people. Perhaps it was to do with the whole temple system. So you turn the page over, end of Luke 20, and here we come to Luke 21, and Jesus looks up and sees a widow giving everything she owned into the temple offering. Now you tell me, is Jesus likely to be saying, "I think you should follow the example of that widow in giving everything you have to this corrupt institution"? Do you think that Jesus would think that that's a good idea? Maybe we should talk about it over supper. If you read the passage really carefully, Jesus never praises the widow's actions. He simply points out that she has given more than they. She's given everything that she had to live on. It's a bit like saying, "You hypocrites, you flash your cash around, making sure that everybody sees you dropping your $100 bills into the temple offering, but it costs you nothing," and we all know that. It's pocket change. Meanwhile, this widow gives everything she has to your exploitative system and then goes home with nothing. There is something wrong with that. Jesus, I don't think, is commending the widow's sacrifice. He's not critiquing the widow, not at all. He's critiquing a system that's taking advantage of her generosity. You'll notice from the Bible reading, usually the widow's mite story finishes at, she gave more than you guys. But I deliberately put in the next two verses because in the very next verse, Jesus predicts that this temple is coming down, which it did about 30 years later, never to be rebuilt. So I think that this story is a critique of the corrupt temple system of the first century. So what do we do with that? It could equally be a critique of any institutions that purport to be for the benefit of all, but end up ripping off the very people it was set up to benefit. It's churches that tie prosperity to giving, that manipulate people into giving more than they can afford on the promise of financial blessing in return. It's social media influencers who purport to sell happiness to their followers via expensive products. It's robo-debt, isn't it? It's the buy now, pay later industry that promises easy money but then traps people into a spiral of debt. It's lobby groups that make political donations in order to buy influence. It's educational institutions who offer free iPads if you'll just sign up for their government-funded programs. It's insurance companies that don't pay out because of their buried fine print. It's any industry, religious or not, that looks for ways to make handsome profits from people's misery or fears or disadvantage. I wonder if I've ruined the story of the widow's mite for you. I'm sorry. If you, like me, found the widow an inspirational figure to emulate, well, there's no doubting her generosity. There's no doubting that she made a sacrificial act. Jesus isn't critiquing her. And there are many other passages of Scripture that encourage generosity and sacrificial love. But this isn't one of them. Not when you read it in its context, reading it from beginning to end. If you want this story to change the way that you see things, then remember the widow whenever you see the vulnerable being exploited for the gain of the powerful. Remember the widow when you see industries, institutions, influential people who hide perpetrators and shun victims, who make grand promises that they have no intention of keeping, who manipulate people into giving what they cannot afford, whose business models are designed to trap people into spiralling dependency, who harm people in the pursuit of their own gain, who step on people in their rush to the top, who use people and love things instead of loving people and using things, and who use religious authority to denigrate and dismiss and discard people. Well, I could stop there and we could all just wallow in moral outrage, couldn't we? It's a tempting path. You can get addicted to moral outrage. It's a real danger for me, you know. I'm just drawn to that. I reckon I spent at least an hour wallowing in moral outrage while I was writing this sermon. I was just really, because it feels good to point out the evils of society and why it shouldn't be like it is. A pleasant Sunday morning activity, scrolling through your Facebook feed or your favourite news site, feeling moral outrage for like 5 different issues and then scrolling on to the next one before breakfast. And then you can get on with the day's activities, feeling like you've really accomplished something. Feeling that comforting sense of moral superiority. God, I thank you that I'm not like them. Thank you that I'm not like those people. Jesus told a story about that too. It's back in chapter 18. It's called the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And Jesus tells that one just before he meets Zacchaeus, the tax collector. See, everything's connected. Things are just rarely as black and white as they seem. It's impossible to divide institutions, industries and influential people into morally good and morally bad categories. It's just not that simple. And our moral outrage comes undone when we realise that we're inevitably part of these systems too. We can't escape. It's just part of the human condition. I said a couple of weeks ago, remember Isaiah? He said, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." And following Jesus doesn't mean we're miraculously transported out of that. What it means is that we've got someone who has overcome it walking beside us as we walk through it. I was thinking about the temptations that Jesus faced at the very beginning of his ministry. Again, in Luke's story. You've got to stay in the same gospel when you do this stuff. Jesus was hungry, and the devil made the tempting suggestion that since Jesus was the Son of God, surely he could wave his magic God wand, turn a few stones into bread, take a divine shortcut. But Jesus refused because he came to share in the human condition. And there's no magical shortcuts to escape it. He's going to walk through it. He's not going to rise above it. Well, if you insist on being human, says the devil, as he took Jesus to show him all the kingdoms of the world, I know how you can get ahead in this human world and gain power for yourself over all of these kingdoms. You see, I know the methods that you can use to climb the ladder to get to the top. You just follow me and I'll show you how you can get a poor widow to give a last cent and bow down and worship you when she does it. No thanks, said Jesus. I think I'll stick to the methods that God showed me. They might seem crazy and ineffective to you, but I've got faith that they'll work in the long run. Wow, that's really noble of you, said the devil, as he led Jesus to the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem. I bet people will admire such humility and piety and self-sacrifice. I'll tell you what, let's put that on display for all of the world. Throw yourself down from the highest point in a display of noble self-sacrifice, and everyone will be amazed. And you know that God will save you anyway. You won't actually have to give anything up. But Jesus said, nah, I'll just stick with what God has planned, I think. And he did. And it led him to the cross, where everything seemed to go so wrong, and yet it turned out to be something so right. As you walk through this week, spend some time slowing down. Read the story of the widow once again and reflect on it. See what you see in it. Happy to take emails. Contact me on Slack. But then follow Jesus through the week until the day that he's executed by the Romans. And let's just see what that story does. Oh, the widow who gave and the temple that took. A final quote from James. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their adversity, and to keep oneself unstained by the world.